The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, and it's Thursday, August 7th. Today, we are asking, how are the Democrats doing? Are they doomed? Because the attitude is pretty doomy out there. Well, we don't actually have to guess because we've got polling and we are going to talk about it. Here in Massachusetts, at least, our congressional Democrats have been a united opposition vote against the administration's showpiece bills, and the focus on the state level seems to be codifying the civil rights they see as under attack. So how is the public feeling about this? Nationally, is Massachusetts feeling any better? Well, I am happily joined by Rich Parr, Vice President of the MassINC Polling Group and our Western Mass Bureau Chief. Hey, bud.
Hey there, how you doing?
I'm doing okay all the way over here in Eastern Massachusetts. Sorry to report.
This is 2 weeks in a row for me, which may be a first time on the horse race.
That's thrilling. We're going to have to set up a very special west-east, east-west rail just to podcast live from the tracks.
That's right. We're going to put our ears on the east-west rail and be able to hear each other, our vibrations across the state.
I feel like I would flunk science class if I proposed that back in the day, but, who knows? Nobody can judge me on that now. I think that we should probably, before we get into the universe of polling, talk about the other kind of numbers, statistics, and survey-related news sort of sweeping national politics right now, which is the firing of the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which, as a pollster, Rich, if I had to guess, you think is a wild turn of events.
Yeah, this is a red flag. If you're keeping score of the maybe the authoritarianism index that's going on in the country right now, firing the person who does the jobs report is not a good thing. And as a pollster or as a person who does surveys and survey research, this is particularly striking because, and some people may not know this, the jobs report is itself a survey, right? They are going out, they are talking to employers about how many people they've hired or fired or let go. The unemployment rate, which is also reported at the same time, is a separate survey. That's of households, but there are two separate survey items that are reported each month. So what happened was that the jobs report came in quite low for this current month, and there were downward revisions of the prior 2 months, which is a standard practice that as the Bureau gets more information about what actually happened, they go back to the surveys and tweak them a little bit. But collectively, the jobs picture became a lot gloomier on Friday, and the president responded by firing the person in charge of making things gloomier for him. And that's where we are right now, and it's not a great place to be.
This does seem connected to a theme that we've touched on a few times, which is essentially when you're in kind of a public communication role, if you're doing polling, if you're doing journalism, one of the things that we hope that we're operating from is a sort of shared agreement on where we get our facts from. If you want to know what the opinion of the president is, you can go to some reliable surveys. If you want to know what the jobs numbers are, you can go to some reliable statistics. If you need to know whether or not the attorney general is going to be suing over a specific policy, you can go and look at these very specific reports that have been done in these very specific ways for a very long time. So from a how do we agree on this fundamental information perspective? Where is your head at right now? Do we have the same grounding that we did before?
I think it's in the polling area, it's shifting. I mean, in terms of the government statistics, whether it be on economic data or on scientific data or climate data, I think we're definitely taking a step backwards, a step in the wrong direction. The media landscape has definitely been shaken up by this as well. So, one of the places that people used to go to all the time for their polling aggregations and predictions was the website 538, which started as an independent thing, and then I think it went to the Times, and then it went to the to ABC News, and then ABC News shuttered that not long into the Trump administration. So we don't have 538 anymore doing all of their aggregations of the various polls and looking at each pollster and determining how much weight to put on each one. But we do have people who are continuing to do that on other websites. Kind of pick your poison on that. Real Clear Politics has been doing this for a long time. They have a slightly more rightward bent. So if you're interested, you can go over there and see how Trump is performing and how Democrats are performing. And then G. Elliott Morris, who is a pollster who used to be with The Economist, who did the Economist poll, which was fielded by YouGov, now has his own he's out on his own shingle, and he's got his own newsletter, and he's been doing an aggregator now that just started. He's doing Trump approval. He's doing the generic ballot for Democrats versus Republicans for Congress. So that stuff is out there, but it is harder to find. One of my favorite data journalists in this realm, Philip Bump, actually of the Washington Post, just left the Washington Post. He just decided to quit, and I think he just did not like the direction that paper was headed in, and a lot of the opinion columnists there have been moving away. So you see this kind of disturbing pattern across all sorts of media with the 60 Minutes settlement, with various other settlements with the Trump administration, of folks it's getting harder and harder to trust the numbers from the media. It's getting harder and harder to know what you're getting from the government sources. Who knows who's going to trust the next jobs report now that we have had some political interference on that front. And it's just going to make it harder for people to make decisions about things if they're not certain about what the real data is.
That's right. I think that's a really important note to hit on here, which is that it's simultaneously a kind of meta conversation about how do we know what is a reliable number, and then what does it mean when the numbers do not feel reliable to people. So you noted, of course, that people look at the jobs report for a reason. It's a really important indicator on how the economy is doing. And that, of course, is why the president was not happy when it showed a less than sunny picture when he's going out there and saying everything's great and don't look at the tariffs behind the curtain, everything's fine. So kind of breaking it down a little bit, because it's not just that you're in the polling business because you like looking at a lot of numbers, but when you think about what it means when people don't understand if the literal labor statistics can be trusted, what does that mean to you?
I mean, I think it's the further kind of atomization of where we get our news from. And, we were in a situation where we've gone from the big three television networks and a couple of national newspapers a couple of generations ago now to completely go through the era of cable news, now to the era of social media, and people get their reality confirmed on a daily basis by whatever is coming into their feed. So it's one more thing to fight about, right? We don't have, this is one more benchmark that we can kind of question and say whether this is really real or not. We're seeing it in the polling too. I mean, Donald Trump was on, I think, CNBC or one of the business things doing one of his call-in interviews, and he claimed that he had the best polling numbers of any president ever. And that is demonstrably not true.
I saw that. I immediately thought of you folks.
Yeah. So I saw some pieces this morning of pollsters like Harry Enton at CNN, who's great, being asked, well, is this true? And he's like, no, it is very much not true. In fact, Donald Trump is the second lowest performing president in terms of approval rating at this stage of his presidency, second only to himself in his first term. So that is kind of the benchmark that we're at right now. I think I've seen numbers lately. UMass Amherst had a national poll that came out. I think it had him at 38 or 39% approval. So very much underwater. And, as you said, Jen, we have these tariffs. These tariffs have been kind of talked about, pulled back, readjusted, but they are eventually going to hit. And eventually the inventories that people have built up of pre-tariff goods are going to be exhausted, and there will be a reckoning in terms of the prices of things that hit. And that is going to have a real, send a real ripple through the economy. Well, we don't know what the size of that's going to be yet, and how that kind of filters through everybody's information screens. But it's that feels to me like it's going to have a more real impact than any of the other stuff that could be kind of fudged or parsed.
Yeah, I think to kind of put a button on that one, that it's sort of a snake eating its own tail here, which is that it becomes very hard for people to understand what the implications are of these sort of major policy changes when the places that you would normally look to for assessments on how that's doing, like, for instance, the jobs market, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when you're trying to figure out how these policies have ended up rippling out through the economy, when there's then a lack of trust or a suspicion of those numbers. So it becomes not just harder to get a sense on kind of the macro, hey, how's everybody feel about the performance of any particular politician, but where do you look to find out if these policies are having the impact that is being claimed? And so it turns into kind of this uncomfortable snowball that I think brings us to the reason that we're here today. And it's a little bit connected to what we've been talking about before, which is, how are all of the parties doing? Because Donald Trump is the figurehead of the Republican Party, and much of the Republican Party is attached to him in a very kind of concrete way. But how do people feel about the concept of a generic Republican these days?
Yeah, I don't think that either party is doing particularly well right now, and I don't think approval of Congress is doing particularly well. Last night on the news, saw the latest video of a Republican in a strong red district, I think in Nebraska, who went home for his town hall and got completely lambasted by his supporters. So there's a lot of anger, even in kind of pretty firmly red areas with the Republicans. But I think the alarm bells for Democrats is that they might have been expecting a little bit of a tick up as the opposition party. But if you want to get a tick up as the opposition party, I think their voters are telling them that they need to act like an opposition party. And I think that some of the decline in the approval ratings for the Democratic Party has to do with that sort of lack of fight that some on the farther on the left would like to see more of from the Democrats, and that might account for some of the reasons why their numbers are pretty soft right now.
Yeah, well, let's put some hard numbers to that. Not so many that it sounds crazy for our listeners, but voter registration for Republicans and Democrats, approval ratings for kind of key Democratic and Republican figures. What are you looking at when you're talking about sort of those feelings softening?
So in Massachusetts, with automatic voter registration, voters are now being brought onto the rolls automatically unenrolled, and therefore the percentage of unenrolled has really surged, and the percentage of people who are still registered in either of the parties has declined very precipitously. So we have more people registered, more unenrolleds, fewer Democrats, fewer Republicans. So what you need to look at if you're interested in kind of understanding which party has kind of got the hearts and minds is party identification. And Gallup has been tracking party identification for decades nationally. And their latest figures are showing that the Democrats have kind of surged a bit recently and now have a slight lead over the Republicans in terms of the percentage of Americans who consider themselves to be a Democrat, or if they're an independent, they're asked a follow-up question, which way would you lean? So if you combine the Democrats and the lean Democratic, you've got 46% now saying that versus 43% for Republicans. And that has flipped in the last quarter. When it looks like Gallup does this quarterly, it was almost completely even. And now the Democrats have ticked up a little bit and the Republicans have ticked down.
And one of the terms I've been throwing around a little bit is this idea of generic. And so, one thing that's very interesting when we're trying to suss out who has a better chance going into a midterm election or anything like that is how a so called generic Republican or a generic Democrat would do. And Rich, there are specific questions on this that we see come up year over year over year. What does that actually mean? And how does it help us get a sense of which party's on top?
Yes, we're referring to the generic ballot question, which is can be asked in a variety of different ways. But since most of these polls are national, you can't ask about Joe Smith versus Mary Jones in a particular congressional district. That you need to ask a question that everybody in your poll can answer. So here are some examples. So if an election for U.S. Congress were being held today, who would you vote for in the district where you live? So that might be something you might ask and then say the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. Or if the election for U.S. Congress were held today, would you vote for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate? Or sometimes it's asked more broadly, what is your preference for the outcome of this November's congressional elections, a Congress controlled by Republicans or a Congress controlled by Democrats? So all of those question types are considered to be generic ballot questions. So if you're looking at a website that aggregates the generic ballot, just keep in mind that any of those question types might be kind of how that's asked, and essentially we're tracking how is the Democratic answer versus the Republican answer doing in those polls, taken as a kind of a rolling average over time. But G. Elliott Morris, the former Economist pollster, has started tracking the generic ballot. He currently has it at Democrats with a slight lead. So 45.1 to 42.8 for Republicans. And again, that's any poll that has asked this question nationally. But in terms of it gives you a sense of who basically Americans want to see running Congress after the next election. And right now, the Democrats have a slight lead on that. A slight lead, though. And you might argue that maybe that lead ought to be bigger, given that that Donald Trump's approval ratings are not good, given that the polling that we've seen on the major piece of legislation that the Republicans passed is pretty unpopular. So there's a host of reasons to say maybe the Democrats are actually underperforming a little bit here, even though they're not, completely out in the wilderness.
And what's the viewpoint look like from Massachusetts on this? Because one thing that occurred to me as we were getting ready to record is, funnily enough, our congressional delegation here is a pretty good spread of what we might mean when we talk about sort of a generic group of Democrats. You have some like far more left-leaning members like Elizabeth Warren and Ayanna Pressley. You've got, the Keatings, you've got the Auchinclosses, you've got the Neals, you have kind of more moderate traditional Democrats that certainly aren't Republicans, but they're also more moderate Democrats. So you, of course, as the local Massachusetts, you are from Massachusetts, right?
Yes, I am from Eastern Massachusetts. I am in exile in the West at the moment. So yes.
I'm just double checking. I was like, I don't think you're from Western Massachusetts, Rich, even though that is your base here. So when you're thinking about Massachusetts Democrats and the flavors that we have, is that useful when you're thinking about kind of national attitudes toward Democrats?
Yeah, I think you make up an interesting point. It's like you can it's like going to Friendlies to evoke a Western Mass. I was going to say Baskin Robbins, but we should keep it more local. But you got all the flavors of ice cream, right? So our Democratic Party is so dominant, frankly, in our political landscape that folks who might maybe be a Republican in another state are kind of part of the Democratic Party here. So we run the flavor from kind of center to left in terms of our delegation. I've got Jim McGovern out here, who I think is one of the more progressive members. But then you've got Seth Moulton, Jake Auchincloss kind of representing more of a centrist position. And then, of course, Kathleen Clark in the leadership trying to hold it all together, right? So it'll be interesting to see. I don't think any of those congressional folks have pulled a primary challenger yet, right? We do have one primary challenger announced for Ed Markey, who is up for re-election and in 2026. A political novice. I don't think someone who's run before. His name's Alex Racleen. I went to his website today, and it's interesting the issues that he's talking about. They're not super progressive. They're much more like reform minded, like judicial reform, electoral reform, voting reform, and then essentially just fighting more, wanting more opposition to what's going on in Washington. It's almost not even an ideological divide. It's more just sort of a matter of tenor and tone that I think some of the Democrats who are dissatisfied with their party are looking for at this point. They want more fight from the party.
I think that that's a really good point, because when we're thinking about Massachusetts and Democrats in general, there's a real split between kind of what's asked of the national congressional delegation or national public figures and sort of what's asked of the state legislature, essentially. And so the approach sort of on the state level is often, well, we'll try and shore up essentially the things that Massachusetts has that we would like to keep as they are. There's been a lot of discussion, for instance, around well, if we want to continue on this trajectory of kind of doing good innovation work, boosting our data collection here in the state, well, how do you do that while keeping in mind that the Trump administration now has an appetite to collect immigration data at a scale that it didn't before? So, how do you kind of balance the needs of a thriving and growing Massachusetts economy with kind of the interests of protecting it against a national administration that might be in conflict with those basic values? But then you also interestingly see in cities across the country, including Boston and also recently in New York, the rise of politicians who ostensibly would be looking at this from kind of a very concrete municipal level. So, of course, I'm talking about mayors or potential mayors in cities like Boston, New York, Chicago, Detroit, that sort of thing. Here in Massachusetts, Michelle Wu is an interesting case because she is running for reelection and made not just local but also national headlines when she went before Congress to defend Boston's stance as a city that does not offer cooperation with US immigration authorities without a warrant specifically. So when you're looking at these local politicians who, yes, are focused on kind of the bread and butter issues, but also seem like they want to also take on that kind of national political lane at the same time, how are people feeling about that?
I mean, I say this a lot with apologies to Speaker Tip O'Neill, but all politics is national now. I really believe this. I think that in terms of the information that people are able to absorb and what they're prioritizing, it's all from the top down filtered in. And I think that the Boston mayor's race is a really interesting example of this. Steve and I talked about this last week, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but the most recent state or local poll that we have about anything electoral is the Boston mayor's race. And Michelle Wu has really high favorabilities in that poll. This is a extremely Democratic town, Democratic stronghold. She's got really high job approval. She's winning 2-1 in terms of the ballot for her reelection. And I believe even, I could be wrong about this, I think they asked a question in that Suffolk poll of whether you would want to see Michelle Wu run for higher office, and a majority said that yes, that they would. So, looks like a very bright present and bright future for Michelle Wu. And what is the one thing that really defines this race so far? It is Michelle Wu's opposition to the Trump administration, going down to Congress, standing up to Republicans and defending her approach to public safety and immigration in Massachusetts against Republicans who wanted Massachusetts to cooperate with ICE raids and so on and so forth. I think that's really galvanized Democrats behind her, and is an example of the kind of fight that that folks are looking for right now from their electeds. And I would say that is also seen on the other side of the ticket in this particular race, because you see Josh Kraft now desperately trying to make back up some ground here, and very much trying to sort of convince people that he is not related in any way, shape, or form to Donald Trump, despite whatever family connections there may be there or past associations with his family and the Trump administration or Donald Trump personally. So he gets it too. He understands that this is a toxic brand that he needs to get away from, and that Michelle Wu is seeing benefits from being actively opposed to it.
But the ask, as we've sort of alluded to, is not quite that straightforward for the federal delegation, because the Democrats have no power in either party in Congress. Technically speaking, they can be loud about stuff, but they are loud and outvoted on a pretty regular basis at this point. So what exactly does it mean for national politicians when all politics is national?
Yeah, so I think it's a tougher needle to thread for the folks who are our senators and our representatives, because they have to answer to a broader constituency, right? In Boston, you can pretty much be maximalist Democrat and know that you're going to be okay in a municipal election where a lot of Democrats are going to turn out. But we did a poll back in the springtime. The MassINC Polling Group did, and I wrote it up with John Gee, our podcast producer emeritus here for the horse race, and And what we found essentially was that there is a big divide between Democrats and everybody else in the state in terms of what they want their elected leaders to be doing with respect to the Trump administration. Do they want maximum opposition to everything that the Trump administration and Republicans are trying to do, or do they want to try to find some wins, try to find some compromises? And the Democrats are we found that a majority of folks wanted that opposition, and then it flips over when you're looking at the rest of the independent voters, and certainly Republicans want to see more cooperation because they're more supportive of the Republican agenda. But that's what this sort of spectrum of Democrats that we have in our congressional delegation are having to contend with, thinking about their particular part of the state and how blue is it, how purple is it, right? How many independents, how many Democrats? How can I satisfy the desires to be sufficiently opposed to the Trump administration while also trying to find something that I can consider a win to bring back to my district for the people who are less ideologically minded about all of this.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group. The MassINC Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massincpolling.com.
So we've spent, I think, the bulk of this on a really great sort of diagnostic, like laying out sort of what this framework looks like, what we've seen in terms of the polling. So I guess that means that I then get to hand you the hardest question, which is essentially, Democrats are often considered in disarray. They're kind of considered doomy. It's a very pessimistic party a lot of the time, which is kind of a funny thing to watch. Should they be right now, and where?
I'm going to zag a little bit and be a little more optimistic than maybe the Democrats themselves are, because there is it is the traditional thing that Democrats are much more likely to sort of backstab, much more likely to kind of have the off the record report in the article criticizing this, that, or the other thing. I think you're seeing it in the New York mayor's race, how many people who are sort of opposed to the front runner there, and haven't quite reckoned with what's going on in that particular race. But I think that if you look at where the Democrats stand on the generic ballot, yes, their approval, even among Democrats, is low, but it's among people who are to their left and not likely to flip over and want to vote for a Republican next year. If you look at the economic outlook and the way things are trending and how that plays into elections, I think the thing I'm most concerned about, honestly, is not so much whether how the Democrats might perform; it's whether they'll have the opportunity to perform. Because I'm very concerned about the prospects for a free and fair election in 2026. We're seeing this gerrymandering attempted down in Texas. There may be other states that follow suit. There might be Democrats who then get pressured to respond in kind. Is that a good thing overall? If every single state starts to look completely red or completely blue, that's going to bottle up a lot of local pressure of folks who don't feel like their voices are being heard. And I think that could really be a bad thing for the country overall. So I think that if we do have, what we might call a conventional midterm elections, I think the Democrats still stand to do pretty well, even if they themselves are concerned about it right now.
Yeah, one thing that I've been watching for many years at this point that you remind me of is the kind of fundamental question between these two parties, right? Which is, are there, and I'm not talking about kind of the meaningful ideological differences, those are absolutely a given. I mean, sort of in terms of strategy, which is, if something works for Republicans or if something works for Democrats, is the kind of best, most politic, best for civil society approach then when power hands over to the other party to basically use all of those tools to essentially do the same thing to the best of your ability. So that's why you see so many debates over, do you get rid of the filibuster? Well, no, because we might no longer be in the majority, and then they'll try and push something through, and we need to use the filibuster to hold them off, or around gerrymandering, which has come up even here in Massachusetts about the question of, well, we have an extremely locked down Democratic coalition, not just at the national level, but also on the state level, at basically every level of government, though, of course, there are some areas of the state that aren't as firmly Democratic or actually tilt over into conservative. So when you are talking about the process of constructing elections and kind of constructing power structures, and should politicians get to pick their own voters, how are you contextualizing that here in Massachusetts, where we basically have no competition for these seats? We're essentially a Democratic state, but at the same time, does that give us any insight into the plight of Democrats elsewhere in the country?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's sort of a strange small c conservatism to the way that the state party operates in the legislature, which is to say that they really don't want to put any of their, because the Democratic Party is so broad in Massachusetts, it does run the gamut from some pretty conservative Democrats to very liberal Democrats, and I think that there's a feeling that that leaders don't want to necessarily put even their most conservative members in a tough bind, and therefore perhaps some of these conversations aren't really happening at the level that you think that they might be able to happen in a very safe blue state. In terms of the national picture, some of what you were saying earlier reminded me of the classic meme that you see of like Lucy with the football and Charlie Brown. It was particularly around the filibuster and the rules in the Senate, or some of this redistricting stuff. I feel like there's a lot of anger among rank and file Democrats that their party does not take full advantage of these sorts of procedural tools when they are in power, or the sense that there's some sort of sense of decorum or rules that they feel they need to follow, but which is not followed by the other side when they are put into that position of governance. And I do wonder now, because the Republicans are going so far in that direction on many fronts now, whether if the Democrats do get power again in 26, whether you'll see a different approach to those sorts of those sorts of procedural things, and whether it'll be a little bit more scorched earth, because there's just so much. Again, this sense of wanting, they're just wanting, not even a difference on policy per se or ideology, just wanting more fight out of their elected leaders. I think there's really a strong sense of that right now.
So, in the most concise way to sum up your contrarian opinion on the state of the two parties right now, what are you identifying as the kind of political weaknesses of the Republicans versus the Democrats right now?
First off, I think that neither party is polling particularly well, but you have to look at where that erosion of support is coming from on the political spectrum. And I think with Democrats, a lot of it's coming from their left. It's coming from their flank. It's folks who don't think they're fighting hard enough for the things that they say that they believe in, and that they're getting frustrated with that. But are those people going to flip over and vote for a Republican in a midterm? I mean, maybe they won't vote, but most likely I think they're going to see the opportunity to vote against Donald Trump and against Republicans, and they're going to say they're going to swallow hard and they're going to vote for their local Democrat. With the Republicans, I think, and particularly with Trump's approval ratings being so low, they're bleeding more from the center. They're bleeding more from moderate people, or maybe people who kind of, gave them a chance and now they're not liking so much what they're seeing, some buyer's remorse. They thought that Trump was going to come and reduce prices. Tariffs are possibly going to raise prices, or most likely going to raise prices. A lot of what was in their tax bill was very unpopular with, according to polling that's been done on that. So that's another area where they think they're going to lose from the center. So, and those are people who could maybe vote for a Republican in 26, but might not. So, or maybe they would consider voting for a Democrat as a protest against what they're not liking so far in the first 2 years of this second Trump term. So, yes, I think Democrats need to worry about their low approval ratings with their own party, but I think Republicans need to be looking at the broader picture of their more general unpopularity and wonder how that's going to come back and hurt them next year.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. We will see if either party feels nimble enough to pivot, or if they even want to, or if they're happy just keeping the steamship pointed in the right direction. But for now, Rich Parr, thank you so much for joining me to talk about whether or not the Democrats are doomed.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And since that's all the time we have for today, I am Jennifer Smith signing off with the excellent Rich Parr. Our producer is Charlie Cazella. You can write to us at the Horse Race Podcast at gmail.com. Don't forget to give the Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. That helps other people find us. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to the MassINC Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.